holding talks in Riyadh. The parties took 2 lunch breaks and resumed communication. This meeting was held behind closed doors. The Russian delegation, according to the Ukrainians, is headed by diplomatic wolfhounds. This is Senator Grigory Karasin, who is called Mr. KGB in Kiev, and advisor to the director of the FSB, Sergei Besida. Previously, he headed the 5th Directorate of the FSB, which was responsible for the Ukrainian direction. The main issue today is the Black Sea deal. The Telegraph specifies that the talks are devoted to the safety of shipping and the end of the tax on ports. The Guardian writes that the Ukrainian delegation remains in Riyadh and is waiting for the end of the meeting between Moscow and Washington, so that, if Washington demands it, they can meet again. The Ukrainians themselves, as always, are dressed in the usual military style, as if they had just come from the trenches, although the head of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense Umarov and the head of the delegation did not appear at the front. Everything that is known at this minute. The United States agrees to Russia's conditions. Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions are going to Moscow, and Kiev is abandoning NATO. Well, that is, to put it simply, after huge losses, the Ukrainians returned to the conditions of Istanbul 2022, having lost the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions to Russia. Exactly at 10 o'clock in the morning of Moscow time, the Russian delegation, the head of the International Committee of the Federation Council, former Deputy Foreign Minister Karasin and advisor to the FSB Director Besida appear at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. The meeting is closed to journalists. The only footage of Russian diplomats was published from the lobby. Filming had to be done secretly. The negotiators are closely accompanied by organizers in national dress, headscarves, and tunics. The most important issue for discussion is the Black Sea deal, which the Ukrainians already disrupted in 2022. At that time, wheat began to explode suspiciously in dry cargo ships, and it became known that it was not food, but weapons inside.
We proceed from the fact that today the issue of the Black Sea Initiative and all aspects related to the resumption of this initiative is on the agenda. This was President Trump's proposal, and President Putin agreed to this. It was with this mandate that our delegation went to Riyadh. This is primarily about shipping safety. But if you remember this deal in its previous form, it contained a fairly large part of the obligations to our country, which, by the way, were not fulfilled last time.
The composition of the Russian delegation caused shock in Kiev. The head of Ukrainian intelligence Budanov calls the FSB Colonel General the most dangerous adversary and personal enemy.
They have one person at the level of the special services. Very problematic for us. This is Mr. General Besida. He is a very problematic person. He has done a lot of evil for Ukraine. Now he is doing his job. Unfortunately, not in favor of Ukraine. He continues to work, and he continues to be a very serious enemy. He is an adversary and enemy of our state.
With Karasin, things are even worse. Former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko was personally acquainted with him even before the Maidan. He is taken aback even by the initials of Lavrov's former deputy. Karasin Grigory Borisovich, abbreviated as KGB.
I have had the experience of very difficult work with Mr. Karasin since 2009, who was then called Mr. KGB in our foreign ministry and around the world. These are the first letters of his last name and patronymic. I also know very well the principles of work of Mr. Besida, the head of the former 5th Directorate of the FSB. This directorate works on Ukraine, right? Absolutely right. And they are very well informed about the situation in Ukraine. Well, Karasin is such a diplomatic wolfhound. And we should have the same wolfhounds in our delegation, but they are not there.
The delegation from Washington is headed by Michael Anton, whom the U.S. President appointed to the post of Director of Policy Planning in the State Department. He is the Chief Foreign Policy Strategist. The second negotiator is Andrew Peake, a Senior Director at the White House National Security Council. He is also Donald Trump's personal choice.
The Russian negotiators will meet with the American side in Saudi Arabia on Monday, but will not meet face-to-face with the Ukrainian delegation. The Russian and Ukrainian teams will be located in separate rooms for now, and only the American negotiators will move around. 3 teams from the United States plan to coordinate this process. The Americans will have separate conversations with the negotiators from each country. We are closer to peace than ever before. It started with President Trump talking to both leaders one-on-one. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and I have engaged the Russians and Ukrainians at our level. And now we actually have technical teams of Ukrainians and Russians conducting indirect negotiations on the same platform. Now we will talk about a ceasefire in the Black Sea so that both sides can transport grain, fuel, and resume trade. Of course, we will also discuss the demarcation line.
Trump's friend and envoy Steve Witkoff, who has spoken to Putin twice, said that the new borders of Ukraine have already been effectively drawn. Witkoff also verified for the first time the referendums in the new territories as a legitimate right of the people.
Speaking about these 5 regions that have become part of Russia, Russia considers these territories its own. Referendums have been held there, and these events have been confirmed. I have never seen a conflict that could be resolved without establishing the facts, and we have established them. I do not see Putin wanting to seize territory in Europe. The situation today is very different from what it was during World War II. There was no NATO then, and now all countries are armed. As for me, in this sense, I take Putin at his word, and the countries of Europe are starting to understand this.
Witkoff also told a very personal story about Trump and Putin. The Russian president prayed for his health when Trump survived an assassination attempt and was wounded by a sniper.
When our president was shot, Putin went to a local church, met with a priest, and prayed for Trump. Not because he was the president of the United States. He could have become the president of the United States. But because they were friends, and he was praying for his friend. Can you imagine sitting there and listening to that kind of talk? And I went home. I passed that message on to our president, and he was clearly touched by it.
The nuances of the negotiations were voiced by Special Envoy Keith Kellogg, a shuttle diplomacy in 2 stages. First, the U.S. team received Ukraine's demands. Then the Americans passed Kiev's position onto representatives from Moscow.
Russia views the negotiations with Trump as a separate area, unrelated to Ukraine. As for Kiev itself, Putin shows no signs of abandoning his main goals, guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO, limitations on the Ukrainian armed forces, and the presence of a certain level of influence on Ukraine's domestic politics. The Kremlin is determined to get as much benefit as possible from Trump's desire for a peace deal in Ukraine, even if it slows down the negotiations. From Moscow's perspective, improving relations with Washington is an economic and geopolitical boon. That can be achieved even if Russian missiles continue to pound Ukraine.
Just 90 minutes later, a technical delegation from Ukraine is hurriedly leaving the luxurious lobby of the Ritz-Carlton. The Kiev negotiators are dressed in identical swamp-colored sweaters. According to the British Times, Kiev is demanding comprehensive military monitoring from satellites during the truce. Bloomberg reports the likely date of the truce. It is the date of Easter. In 2025, Orthodox and Catholic holidays coincide.
The United States wants to achieve a truce in Ukraine by April 20th. The choice of date is due to the fact that this year, April 20th is Easter in both Orthodox and Western churches. However, the planned dates for the truce may be shifted due to the large gap between the positions of the parties. Sources claim that the United States has not yet agreed to Russia's demands to stop supplying weapons to Ukraine. At the same time, European officials fear that Donald Trump may sacrifice Kiev's interests for the sake of a diplomatic triumph.
Member of the Ukrainian Rada Dubinsky reports from the pretrial detention center that all the terms of the deal have already been agreed upon. The delegation from Kiev came to Riyadh only to put a tick, where the negotiators from Washington indicate. Zelensky asks to put pressure not on himself, but on Putin.
This is already the second meeting of the Ukrainian and American teams in Saudi Arabia. This time this meeting is more technical. Our military, our diplomats, our representatives of the Ministry of Energy came there. The conversation was quite useful. The work of the delegations continues. But whatever we talk about with our partners now, we need to put the squeeze on Putin.
If we believe the Telegraph newspaper, Trump is unhappy with Zelensky again. Kiev has not stopped hitting Russian energy infrastructure facilities. CNN admires the Russian president's skills, honed to perfection in the intelligence school of the Soviet KGB. Putin, as it seems to them, is playing with Trump. Now shock content. Time magazine has put Zelensky on the cover again, but for the first time under the headline, "The End of the Game." The author of this article is the so-called biographer and chronicler of Zelensky, Simon Schuster, who glorified Zelensky at the beginning of the war, and the magazine covers can essentially trace the evolution. In May 2022, Schuster published an enthusiastic text about the leadership of the Ukrainian president. In November 2023, he published an article about how not everyone in Zelensky's entourage seemed to believe in victory, and then a huge scandal occurred. In the current issue, Schuster writes that Ukraine must abandon all goals, otherwise there will be nothing left of Ukraine.